Welcome friends to the Romford Elim channel. It's the 1st of April 2020 and as you will be aware we are in the midst of the COVID-19 global pandemic. As a church we've decided to undertake a fast for the first 3 days of this month and to give ourselves to prayer and to seeking the Lord. This is in accordance with God's directive to Solomon as recorded in the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 14. This is what it says. If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. So over the next few days, we'll be praying in accordance with God's directive in this passage, and we really hope that you will join us in this. So what I'm going to do over the course of this fast is to break down 2 Chronicles 7:14. And I hope to do a number of short studies on this passage. The aim is to understand better how we can apply it in our current situation today. So the first video will start by exploring the immediate context of the passage, namely Solomon's prayer in chapter 6. And we'll look at the content of that prayer. This will give us a better understanding of God's response to Solomon in chapter 7. We will explore God's response in a second video. A third video will look at how this directive to humble ourselves and to pray was implemented by people like Daniel. And looking at that, we will see how best we can apply those principles in our context today. Okay. So before we dive into 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 14, let's take a step back and look at the context in which the prayer was made. We pick up the event in 2 Chronicles chapter 6. Now, please let me encourage you to pause the video right here and take 5 minutes to read 2 Chronicles chapter 6 before we continue. So do this now. This will not only increase your understanding, but will also ensure that you're tracking with me through the study. Okay, good. So now let's continue. Solomon had just finished building the temple. The priests had brought in the Ark of the Covenant into the temple, and the nation of Israel were gathered there. In front of the whole assembly, King Solomon knelt down before the altar, spread his hands out to heaven, and he praised the most amazing prayer of dedication to God. I won't read the whole prayer, but we'll only touch on a few points that relate to God's answer in chapter 7. Again, please let me encourage you, if you haven't done so already, pause the video here, go and read 2 Chronicles chapter 6, specifically verses 12 to 42. It will only take you 5 minutes. If you do, you'll have a much greater understanding of how God's reply in chapter 7 connects as a direct answer to Solomon's intercessory prayer in chapter 6. Okay, let's briefly look at a number of the prayer points that Solomon made in his prayer of dedication. He starts with praise and exaltation, magnifying and worshipping the Lord. But you'll see that very quickly Solomon begins petitioning the Lord on behalf of the people and on behalf of the land, specifically for when they sin. He petitions the Lord and pleads that when the people sin, the Lord should hear from heaven and he should forgive. If you see chapter 6 verse 36, Solomon makes reference there. He starts his petition for the people in verse 22. And he prays for when the people sin against their neighbors. I find this interesting that Solomon recognized that God was grieved when the people sinned against their neighbor. So even back then, there was a connection between loving your neighbor and loving God. Solomon recognized this. It is important to consider points such as these in Solomon's prayer because it informs us of God's response in chapter 7. It also speaks to some of the things that God may be referencing when he asks his people to turn from their wicked ways. But we will explore that in the next video. In the next verse, Solomon continues and says, when the people are defeated in battle because they've sinned against the Lord. So he makes the connection with sin in the lives of God's people and the manifestation of defeats in their battles. When he finished making intercession for the people, he begins petitioning for the land. In chapter 6, verse 26 to 31, this is where Solomon intercedes for an open heaven. He intercedes for rain upon the land. It is here where he petitions against famine in the land, against pestilence, and against the disease and the devouring locust. In the next video, we will explore these points in a bit more depth, so please tune in for that video. What is interesting here is that Solomon says to the Lord that whoever of your people, whenever any one of your people pray, please hear and please answer. Solomon was petitioning God that God would recognize and empower the authority and dominion that he had given to his people in his name. Solomon was saying to God, if any one of your people, not just the king, not just the priests, but any one of your people, if they call to you for the sake of the land, please will you hear? Will you answer? Again, this is an important detail as it gives us a better understanding of why God responds by saying, if my people who are called by my name. That was God's response in chapter 7. God is affirming Solomon's petition and saying that anyone who is called by his name can intercede even for the land. Not just the priests and not just the king. I find it interesting that Solomon also intercedes for any foreigners in the land and for those who don't know the Lord. The focus of his prayer was that they would come to know the name of the Lord and that the Lord would be glorified. I'm going to conclude this little section, and I hope you've tracked with me. I hope you've read Chronicles chapter 6. But please join me again in the next video where I'll take a deep dive into 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 14 and look at God's response to Solomon's prayer. If you'd like to know more about the Romford Elim Church, you can find links to our website in the description below. Please leave a comment if you like this video, and please share, like, and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you next time. God bless.